While most of us are content to follow conventional building and flying practices, there are a certain few who seem to be driven to push beyond convention. Throughout the history of model aviation, it's been these innovative modelers who consistently develop the new techniques that eventually become standard practice. Dennis Norman is one of that special breed who never seems content with just making a scale model fly. Like many of us, Dennis began his love for model airplanes at an early age, when the picture on the box promised much more than the completed kit could deliver.
Sadly, I think too many people who modeled as children in the 1940s or 50s will tell you stories of making something. It didn't fly, and it either got set on a shelf, or they went up to the second story of their home or someplace, lit a match, and watched it glide to the ground in flames. I mean, many stories could be had of that type. That's sort of discouraging, and in part, I attribute it, sadly enough, to the type of kits which were commercially successful. I think that a lot of the kits that were put into the market were fine as building exercises, but they were misrepresented as rubber-powered flying scale models or rubber-powered models. They were overbuilt, they had too much structure in them, and they did not perform. And oftentimes they did not hold together well. You might build it exactly as the manufacturer had designed it. You take it out, you have one flight, it stalls, it falls to the ground, and you smash the nose back to the wing. Well, now do you want to start and build a whole new fuselage, or have you had enough of this? This is a keen disappointment. So those things took a lot of people away. Well, the happy thing is that in our more recent years, we're getting back to the fundamentals. We're exploring what was wrong, why weren't these things working, why didn't they fly, why couldn't we get any time out of them, and so forth. And we're solving these problems, and we're having a heck of a good time. My origins, again, with model airplanes were rubber-powered. It was a rubber-powered model. My personal origin with modeling. Of course, I became aware that there were many other kinds of modeling, and I did other types of modeling, solid models out of wood. And plastic was just coming on the scene in my childhood. But the rubber-powered free flight model, again, was the thing that captivated me. Here was something that a person made, and with the intention of letting it go free. Freedom's a wonderful concept, you know? And this is something that a person has made that you release and you turn it into the elements, into the air, to fly, or perhaps not to fly, as the case might be, and that's why it's part of the adventure. And I think that experience of an uncontrolled, free flying model appealed more to me than building a model that I could physically control, like a U-control model or a radio control model. I like fine craftsmanship and I enjoy static models, but I like the dynamic aspect. And one of the things I've said at one point in my life, I studied art commercially, and I carried away from the idea of kinetic things that move. And one of the things I say about this modeling area is that it's kinetic sculpture. It in essence is creating something that is of your own, that you then release to perform as it will in the elements. And as I say, that continues to fascinate me. It's fascinated me all these years, and more so than just creating it to look at, or creating it and then controlling it very carefully with mechanical or electronic means. I like the idea of freedom.
Are model airplanes really a form of art? Those built by Dennis Norman certainly make a strong statement in favor of the concept. His meticulous attention to scale detail goes beyond what's necessary to win in most Flying Aces competitions. And most of us might never build a rubber-powered B-24. But the techniques he's developed over the years can help us all become better modelers. Let's take a look at how Dennis transfers part outlines from the plans to balsa.
let's take a look now at some other techniques that have come along for building rubber part scale models. One of the things that sometimes haunts us as we try to build these things is getting all those parts. If we're working from a kit, the parts may be already printed for us on sheet balsa, or perhaps they're die cut. We just have to punch them out. But if we're looking at an old kit, maybe with old wood that isn't very good, or if we're working with a plan or we're scratch building, we wind up making our own parts, and we have to figure out ways to cut them out and to print them and so forth. There's been a variety of things done over the years. Some people would simply trace them out with a pencil, or they would put a piece of carbon paper onto the part and lay that over top of balsa, and they would trace the part out onto the balsa wood. That was one way. Other people then would get into taking the actual pieces of paper, the parts, perhaps photocopied onto a piece of paper, and they would put rubber cement on the back, and they would then glue that onto the balsa wood, and then you would cut through the paper, cutting out the parts from the balsa wood in that fashion. It worked, but especially with small parts, it was a bit of a problem in that you were trying to peel that paper back off. It was tedious. You were breaking the wood very often, getting very frustrated. Also, of course, you had to scrape off the remainder of the glue, and that added to the complexity and the time-consuming nature of it. A few years ago, somebody discovered that you can take photocopies, most photocopies, and if you lay them down on a sheet of balsa face down, and you take a hot iron, set at something like cotton or linen, a fairly high setting on an iron, and you press firmly, gently back and forth on the back of the piece of paper, the photocopy, the heat will cause a transfer of the print to the wood. And that still is a good technique and one that's being used. I made a discovery in early 1991 which has added yet another method to this. I was attempting at that time to do some coloring using marking, artist markers pens. And I realized as I did that, quite by accident, that a certain combination of markers and photocopies enabled me to transfer or print using a cold technique with the marking pens. Now, the marking pens that I was using were those made by Chart Pack. They have a wide number of them, about 200 or so, I think, in the series. And the photocopies that I found that would react to these markers were those that I made either with Canon or Minolta copiers. Now, to illustrate this for you, I have a plan that I've drawn. It's of a P36A on the peanut scale. And my plan I printed on my Canon copier at my office. And I'm going to show you now how I can take this plan and print the wood parts for it directly from the plan itself without damaging the plan. You'll notice that the parts, as I've put them on the plan here, are actually reversed. I did this for the reason that when I transfer it to the sheet wood, you'll be able to read what the parts are. So let's take now a sheet of 1/32 inch balsa. We're going to lay our plan right over top of it, holding it firmly but gently in place. We're going to take this pen. It's called the Blender, B-L-E-N-D-E-R. It's clear solvent. There's no color in this particular type of pen from Chart Pack. But I'm going to begin coloring the back of this photocopy. Now, as you see as I do this, and I'm going to burnish this a little bit with my finger so that we can kind of help it to transfer over. Make sure we're getting a good contact with the balsa. But as you see, as I do this, I'm getting a transparency, or it's translucent here on the back. Now again, we're coming right down the back of the plan here where the parts are drawn. Pressing firmly but gently. I don't want to crush the wood. But take a look here. You can see how I'm bringing that off. We'll continue this right on down the piece. And I think that pretty well then completes the back. Now let's take a peek here. I want to close this marker up because they do dry out. And look what we have. Our parts have now been printed. Now you see there's some spots where it's a little light, so I'm holding this in place. I'm going to go back and I'm going to hit this again. Try to get a little more intensity in some areas where it didn't come too good. Let's see. All right, now that's better. How about right there? It looks a little light in that spot. We'll go back to that and hit that again. Burnish it down a bit. Let's peel that back. Okay, that's sharp. Here's a light spot here. Burnishing again. A little bit down in here. And let's take a look over on this side. Well, we could hit those spars again a little bit just to bring that out so we get a good sharp print. We're going to take a look at this now in just a second, and you can see for yourself what we have. Okay. All right, now let's take a little look at this. There we go. We've printed from the plan. Now this is drying out. You can see up here at the top. It's drying back fine. It hasn't destroyed the plan at all, really. We could actually make another print off of this. The intensity is such on the print that we could print again. It wouldn't perhaps be quite as dark as this, but we've been able now to transfer. And you can see things read correctly now if you look at the sheet wood. And we're ready now to begin cutting out our parts to build this particular model. Well, making the print wood is just one of the many things I've discovered we can do with these chart pack markers. Another thing we can do is we can actually make our tissue covering, and we can detail it, if you will, as we color it. This is, again, for that P36 peanut model, a sheet of the parts that I've laid out for the covering of the model. The parts themselves were originally taken from scale drawings, which were enlarged to the 13-inch span for a peanut model. Then I took the edges off of the scale drawing, and using that as a master, photostated it again, so that we have dots around here, but those aren't the real scale edges or the lines of the pieces. I'm going to take a minute now and I'm going to cut out a couple of these pieces, and then I'm going to show you how this next step works. Now, after cutting out the parts that we're going to use to print from, I next attach them using double stick tape to a piece of scrap cardboard. We'll set this aside for a minute. I'm going to also then put it on top of a piece of this homosote, this material like we use for our building boards. This gives us a surface to work on. Next, I'm going to show you here a little frame that I've made. This is made from a type of metal channel that's used for making screens for screen doors and windows. There are little rubber or plastic corner pieces. You can cut the lengths as you wish, and then you can put them together and you can make frames, if you will, of different sizes. I attach the tissue, in this case it isn't drum flat, but for our purposes it's close enough, to this, and that is done with that Scotch tape again, that 810 green and black plaid Scotch tape. I'm going to put all this together, as you see here, and the grain of the tissue now is running from tip to tip on the flying surfaces. It would be running the length of the fuselage, pieces that were intended for the fuselage. And I'm going to show you now just the coloring of the top and the bottom surface of this P36 wing. Let's begin by coloring the top with a chart pack color. It's called dark olive, P24. And you'll notice that as I do this, I'm going to color it so that the movement, the stroke, is chordwise. In other words, if I make any stripes or separations as I put the color on, they're going to appear as streaks on the model, and they'll be going in the direction that streaks would go if there were stains on the flying surfaces of the actual aircraft. Again, I'm using firm, gentle, overlapping strokes. This marker has been used a lot and I'm running out of toner, so I'm going to stop in a second here and get us a fresh marker, and I'll be right back with you. Okay, we've changed markers here and we're out to the center. Now we're going to come back over that. We're going to overlap going back out towards the tip of the wing. We can press firmly against this because we have a good base. And although we're coloring the tissue, the marker is smooth and we can press hard right into it. Now there's half of the top surface of the wing. Let's take a minute now and do the same thing, but let's look at the undersurface, the bottom side. Now we're using a gray, a number 5, a medium gray. Again, with the wide variety of colors that Chartpak has in its series, you have lots of choices in terms of color schemes for rubber-powered models. World War I, World War II, modern, whatever. We're going to go continuing back out again, going chordwise. And that for the moment I think will do. Now let's take a second here and we're going to separate. Here now it's dry. It's a little cracking sound. Don't let it alarm you. It's just part of the story. This out. And by putting this on white, you can now see how we have transferred out the markings on the plan, and we have printed all the rivets and the panel lines and so forth right onto the tissue at the same time that we were coloring it. Now let's take a moment and see how this looks on a finished model. Now this is a P36 that's been finished using the techniques with the markers that I was showing you. It's a little larger, of course, than the model that we were working from. That was a peanut scale model. This is an 18-inch span model. But again, let's take a look at it. We can see the undersurfaces. You notice all the detail, all the riveting, panel lines, and so forth. Now I have gone back over this to bring out greater intensity. The U.S. Army, I hit over with black acrylic paint. The tire, the same way, I highlighted that a bit. I did a little highlighting just on the separation of the main flying surface, but all this other information here that you see all printed on there is just as it came off the pen. Also now, I've done the markings, the national insignias, using the markers on bond paper. So the white is actually bond paper. The red in the center has been done with a circle guide using a fine red felt pen, and then it's been filled in with broader tip felt. The blue outside has also been done with a felt pen. Let's take a couple minutes and sort of review the process in which we go from a scale drawing to something that we can print on our covering and actually apply to the model. My example for the moment is going to be the Grumman Hellcat, a peanut scale model. I started with these plans, highly detailed, as you can see. An English set of plans. The English do beautiful work. I made a photocopy of the plan, enlarging it so that the span was 13 inches. When that was done, I took the photocopy and I removed the outside edges of each piece. That gave me a series of pieces like this, which, as you can see, are missing their leading and trailing edges. I've just tacked these onto a piece of white paper with tape. In spots where arrows were drawn to show features on the scale drawing, that sort of thing, I painted those out using a touch-up brush and typewriter whiteout fluid. This works pretty well for the flying surfaces, which are essentially flat. Of course, on the scale drawing, when we look from the top, we are seeing a shape and a size here that would actually be too small when applied to the model. We have a distance to cover on the curvature of the top of the wing, for instance. So by removing these edges, we get around the problem of printing the edges of the drawing short on the actual model. We also give ourselves an opportunity to extend panel lines and so forth if we want to on our master, so that when it's photocopied, we have enough then as it's applied to the model that it covers the entire piece. Once we've taken our basic pieces and we've taped them up, making our photocopy master, we then make copies of that. Here's an example of it. Now, this again is using a Canon or a Minolta copier. These are now ready to be separated and then laid on cardboard and put through the same process we were demonstrating a moment ago with the appropriate colored marker and monoprinted right onto the tissue. Well, this technique works pretty well for the flying surfaces. However, when we get to the fuselages, the round parts, we're a little more challenged. Very often, of course, we have the scale drawing, and we can take the scale drawing of the fuselage piece, such as this one here, and we can print that and get the right size, the length, and so forth. The problem is that if we apply this directly to the model, we'll find that it doesn't match correctly. The model has a compound curve going, and these lines aren't really going to be right on the model. They're going to have a funny curve to them. So we have to come up with some way, if we want to use this printing technique on the fuselage, of curving the lines to make them fit the shape of the fuselage or the nacelle, the compound curve that they're being put over. One idea I have that has shown promise is to take something like a plastic kit. Here we have a monogram. This is a monogram plastic 1/4-inch scale kit. There are many kits on the market of popular aircraft such as the Hellcat, the P-51, the Messerschmitt, so forth, in various scales. But for our purposes, this 1/4-inch Hellcat is just fine. Taking just the pieces of the fuselage and putting them together, we create a three-dimensional working mold or model, and then we take tracing paper, and I've done this already, but I can show you basically what happened here. We put just regular tracing paper on top of this, lined it up carefully, and we took a pencil and we began just marking, making a rubbing, just like you would do with a coin. And we can go over the entire fuselage and get a very crude but accurate drawing of the panels and the rivets on the fuselage itself. Now, of course, that is smaller than the model that we're building, and it's only a starting point. Next, we take a bit of tracing paper and we lay over this, and we take a fine pointed pen and we recreate all of this paneling. That's time consuming. Can't get away from it, but it's worthwhile, I think, because we have, when that is finished, a pattern that has the curves in it that we're looking for. This is a sample of it here, of the pattern for this particular peanut scale Hellcat. Now I'll show you how this looks. This is our model, and I'm going to just loosely position this on. As you see, we have the flying surfaces in place. We take the tail surfaces off as we finish the model up, but for the moment, I'm going to line the spine up. We're going to line the other pieces up here. And if you take a look and see now, notice that those panel lines are going in the right direction. So we now have a pattern which will fit accurately on the model, and we can take this pattern and we can use it to print again on bond paper a master. We can then color that master, transferring all of this riveting and detail onto our tissue that we're going to cover the model with. Then apply the tissue as I was just showing you, color already in place, and we have the paneling going in the right direction, and the model is covered. The fuselage is now covered, or the nacelle if you're covering a nacelle. Now the chart pack markers can be used for any number of subjects. I prefer military types, but I'm going to show you now some of the things that I've done to date. In the First World War era, the Americans were flying Salmson biplanes. These were made by the French, and they had a rather intricate 3 or 4 color camouflage. And this is a Salmson model, a peanut scale model, that has been done using the marker technique. Again, it is very light. The markers weigh virtually nothing. They're just simply staining or dyeing the tissue. And yet, as you can see, we have a good color representation here of the camouflage on the airplane. The World War II types, the Messerschmitt 109 is a favorite of many. This is a team here, and as you can see, the paneling and the details on the underside have been done, again using the marker technique that I'm describing to you. The insignias have been done with bond paper and again copy technique. I find that the bond paper technique for insignias works well, even for insignias like those of the United States, which were dark blue. The black is close enough in color that it gives a fairly realistic impression of the insignia. This particular P-51 is under reconstruction a bit. He flew into a wall here not long ago, so there's some damage to it, but at least you can see again, another application, a little lighter shade of olive drab applied to that one. Now the Hellcat is an airplane that had a rather dark scheme. The underside, of course, was white, very light gray, and it shows nicely the details. These details, again, were printed using the marker technique directly onto the tissue. And then the insignia is a photocopy of a decal, and it's been attached with aliphatic glue. The tissue in this technique is all marked on the frame. It's decorated on the frame. It's given a light coat of flat, clear lacquer on the frame, and then as it's needed for the model, it's cut from the frame and it's applied to the frames of the model itself. I normally use a glue stick for this purpose. I do that because it does not attack the dyes. If I use some of the thinners and solvents that we would normally use in building models with butyrate or nitrate dopes, it's liable to cause bleeding, this technique. So I have to use an adhesive that does not attack the ink or the dye that's been put on the tissue. The markers, or rather the glue sticks, tend to be rather low tack. This is a Denison glue stick and one of my favorites. It has a nice working time of a few minutes. A fairly good tack initially, but what I find is that if I don't do anything more than apply the tissue with the glue stick, after a while the tack starts to relax, and on a humid day in the summer on the flying field, I may find my covering coming off of my model. So to get away from that, I will usually now seal the edges of a piece that I've applied using a glue stick with aliphatic glue, and I just take a round brush and I apply that around the edges. When it dries clear and flat, so you don't see that it's there, but it keeps the piece then attached tightly to the model. I started to say the Hellcat had a dark scheme, and you really can't tell. There's all that detail printed on this dark top surface of the wing, but the intensity of the dye is such that you really can't see it unless you look extremely closely, and I'm not sure that you can see it here just looking as we are today.
As if designing, building, and flying some of the most beautiful scale models our hobby has ever known were not enough, Dennis Norman continues to amaze the rest of us by his determination to build and fly multi-engine rubber-powered bombers. To those of us who find it difficult enough to get a single rubber motor performing properly, the problems inherent in multis seem insurmountable. Dennis, however, seems to enjoy the challenge. In order to get the best from any model, it's necessary to keep its weight down. This can be difficult to do with a scale model bomber, but Dennis has developed new techniques for building light but strong superstructures.
One of the things you'll notice about this particular model is it's pretty sparse. There's not a lot of structure here. That's intentional. We find that it's important to keep models as light as possible to get them to fly, or some people like to say put as much air into the design as possible. So this is what we have, a very airy, open structure, but one that's strong enough to do the job it's supposed to do. Of course, not all fuselages are square or rectangular in section. Many of them, particularly the modern aircraft, are round or oval, or sort of shaped like this. Now, to build a structure with a section like this is a challenge. It's been approached in different ways by different designers. One of the most common has been to divide a shape like this, top to bottom perhaps, lay it on its side, and build one half of the structure, or the fuselage, whatever, at a time on the plan, flat on the board, take it off, build the other half, take that off, and put these two together. That then gives you a fuselage which has the correct shape. Instead of cumbersome, you're using a lot of wood there. A method that I designed 10 or 12 years ago to try to get around that process of laying down on the plan and so forth was to use a freestanding jig. And this is a sample of it. Using this particular thing, we've taken a couple of yardsticks here, and we've attached to them blocks which have been carefully sanded and planed and so forth, but are adjustable. Each block has a little set screw in it and a wing nut, so that, and it is marked as you see here, so that we have, well, there's 13 on the jig at the moment. I think I can put even more, but most fuselages wouldn't have, even 3 feet long, wouldn't have more than about 13 stations in them. But we take the formers, and instead of having them split, we leave them whole, and we put them on at their places on the jig, the whole length. When we have all the formers assembled, tacked on to the uprights, we then put the stringers or the longitudinal pieces in, and that permits us to build half of the structure at one time. We lift that off of the jig then, and we simply then add the stringers to the other side, and we have it all built without having to have split it. That works. It's a bit cumbersome, it's a bit time-consuming, but it does help you to produce a fairly accurate, lightweight fuselage. When I decided to try and build 4-engine rubber-powered models, I felt that I would have to approach it from absolute minimum weight. Some of the old conventional ideas simply were not light enough to give me a structure that I felt would do the job, would stay in the air with rubber power as a motive source. I was reading in a hobby magazine, I think about 1983, somewhere in there, unrelated to model airplanes. It was a shipbuilder's magazine, but they were talking about making wooden skiffs. And the technique they described was to take a male mold, a shape, that was the same as the inside of the skiff, and wax it, and then put pieces of stripwood over it, build the shell in that fashion, and then lift it off of the mold. That gave them then the skiff already hollow on the inside and very scale-like. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting idea for something that I had in mind, which was this Lancaster. So this is the left fuselage mold of the Lancaster fuselage. It is scale-wise about 1/8 of an inch thinner than the fuselage itself. That is, it's been reduced because we're going to add the structure to this that will bring us up to the scale shape of the fuselage. This particular one, as I say, was our first effort, and we carved it from a single piece of wood. Obviously, we took some time to finish it with gray primer. We've coated it with wax, again, as a separating barrier. We kept the edges, though. This is the true center line is actually right here, if you can see, where the gray ends. This is the center line of the fuselage. Beyond that is a piece of wood, in this case, which is there for the purpose of holding the structure that we're gluing. We're going to laminate the structure, attaching it to this uncoated, this raw balsa, bringing it around over the coated waxed mold, and attaching it on the other side. And laminating in this fashion then, we proceeded to put in the formers for the fuselage. When that was done, we added to it the stringers. Now, of course, to build a model using the mold, we do need a mold for each half of the fuselage. And here, as you see with the Lancaster fuselage, we have the mirror halves with their stations already marked, because this is where we built the model. Over here, we have a similar mold. This is for the inside nacelle of the model. Again, the center line, remember, of the piece is right at the separation between the gray and the uncoated balsa here. But we have a mold for each half of each piece that we build. This is a fuselage mold, not unlike what we were looking at for the Lancaster. This particular mold, though, is for the B-17, also at the same scale, ½ inch equals a foot, or 1/24th scale. At this stage now, we've added to this mold the laminated formers, as you see them here, attached again to an uncoated side. They're coming over top of a coated waxed area. And over top of that, I've also now added stringers, a 32nd inch by a 16th inch in this particular model, which is the thinnest that I've used so far. They're set on edge so that the 16th inch thickness is the width as you push into it, giving us a little more tensile strength as we touch the model. This is ready now to be separated from the mold, and when that's done, we'll take a single edge razor and we'll simply go along each station here at the center line, the entire length of the piece. We'll then very carefully lift this entire structure away from the mold, and I'll show you now what we're going to wind up with. Well, the B-17 shows us one way to approach the structure of a fuselage. I've used that method several times, and I'm going to illustrate now a further progression of it with this model of a Hellcat at peanut scale. Again, we have the mold, the half of the fuselage here, similar to what we were looking at for the B-17. And now the model itself. The shells have been taken off the mold, and they've been joined together to form this fuselage structure. Notice, if you will, how open this is. Instead of having formers made out of sheet balsa, you'll see now that our formers are made out of laminated strip wood. They're only about 1/16 of an inch square, very open on the inside. This saves weight and also gives us room for a rubber motor to brake if necessary. Sometimes they seem to find it necessary to brake, without doing serious damage to the structure. Now, the Lancaster fuselage mold was made from one piece of wood. It was carved out in a traditional way, in a way that you might make a solid balsa model, using female sections to check its shape. That's pretty time-consuming, a pretty exacting chore to make a mold like that. Also then, I had attached just pieces of strip wood here, as you see, to the edges of the mold when it was completed. I thought that might discourage other people from trying it, so I came up with a different technique. The technique which I now use and I recommend to you is to start with what I call a breadboard. Now, this is a piece of sheet balsa, usually about 1/4 of an inch thick. A flat, fairly hard wood is fine. This is going to be the thing that you're going to glue the former strips to, the bases to. The center line, in other words, of the piece that you're making is actually going to be right here. It's going to be at this spot. This is going to be on the outside. To that, we then cut a piece of block that will approximate that shape. Now, we could carve that block just as we carved the block to make the Lancaster mold. But again, that's an exacting thing, takes a lot of time and so forth. I came up with another thought, and that was to reverse it, and instead of using a female or a negative shape to check the shape of the piece as it's being carved, I took the inside piece, the inside shape, such as on this model here. This is the scale section of the nose of the fuselage of this piece. And I had scale sections for each station going back through the model. Making those at the correct size, we then simply took the piece of block and we made a cut. We cut a slice of it off, if you would, attached it to this station here. To the front of that block, we put the piece of colored paper cut to the correct cross-section. To the back of it, we put the next cross-sectional piece of paper. Then we cut the next piece of block, and so the process continued until we made a sandwich, I call it. And this is a much larger model that's still in process, but using the same technique. Here we have, it's so big that we've had to use actually several different pieces of wood and block to get it started. But at its heart, we have the sheet balsa, breadboard if you would. On top of that, we have these blocks cut at the stations. Now next, we then take a wood plane, as we were showing you earlier, or a draw knife, something of that nature, and we begin shaping the block down. What we're looking for, of course, is the paper sections. When we reach those sections, we know that we have reached the correct shape for the model. It's faster, I think, to do it this way. Now once the basic mold has been carved, you're ready for the sealing process. Again, take the Scotch tape, the number 810, the high-tack tape, and cover the edge of the breadboard, as we call it, this piece that we're going to be gluing to. You don't want any wax on that. Be sure to use a double boiler when you work with the paraffin. Just a single pan is a dangerous way to approach it, because the paraffin, when it gets to a liquid stage, is very volatile and it may explode on you. But with a double boiler, get it to a liquid stage. Take an old brush. I like to use these foam brushes. They're rubbery and they may get very hard when the wax dries, but when you put it into the warm wax, they get very soft again. And you just simply lightly coat the entire mold. One coat usually is sufficient. Go with the grain to keep it smooth, with the paraffin, the hot paraffin. And you set that aside, let it cool for a while. Go over it carefully. If you have any runs in it of any kind, smooth those runs down with the edge of a blade or something like that. You don't want to scrape the paraffin off, but you do want to have it smooth and in conforming with the scale shape that you've created. Once that's done, then you're going to remove the Scotch tape from the edge of the piece. You can soak your balsa wood strips. For most of the models I'm making, I'm using 1/32 by 1/16 inch balsa. And I soak the balsa usually in just hot water. I have a little tool that I've made for that purpose out of a piece of plastic tubing. It's a very simple, primitive tool, but it works very well. I take and fill this with hot water. It's just rubber banded here with a sandwich bag on one end, and same way up at this end. I put the balsa wood strips that I'm going to use into the hot water, put this other bag, plastic bag over the top, rubber band it on. Now this is nice and warm and wet inside here. When I'm ready to use it, I make a little slit on the side of the top here, and putting this vertically, maybe in a wastebasket or something like that, I just pull out a strip at a time as I need it. Now this is, within 10 or 15 minutes, this wood is soft enough that you can use it. And you take that wood, these strips, as you remove them from this little soaking tube, and you attach them with cyanoacrylic glue, hot stuff, something that dries very quickly, to the edge of the breadboard at the station that you're going to work at. Then you very carefully, keeping an even tension on it, pull the strip wood across over the mold to the opposite side. And again, you attach it with hot stuff or cyanoacrylic glue on the other side. That gives you the first lamination. Most of what I build only has 2 laminations. So when the second one comes, We do something very similar. We take the strip, we attach it with the hot stuff or the sand or acrylic glue at the one edge, but I've coated it with an aliphatic glue like Tite Bond or Sig Bond, something like that. Full strength is fine. A light coat, the length of the piece, so as I bring that second piece down, I'm actually laminating. I'm pushing it together with the first piece, and I finish with cyanacrylic glue again on the opposite side, and that in one operation has created this two-strip lamination, which will be the former at that station. And that's repeated, as I say, the whole length of the piece. When that's done, we then go to the next step, which is adding the longitudinal pieces, the stringers, at their respective scale stations. The spine, again, the center line at the top here, will have a piece of wood right coming up to the edge of that on both sides. And when that is done, we'll be separating this out. The shell will come off. When you put the two shells together, they mate at the center line, and you have a spine that's approximately, depending on what you've used for your wood thickness, usually it's about an 1/8 square, the way it's laminated out in most of the models that I build, two pieces of 1/16 put together. But that makes a fairly rigid spine for the piece, and also, again, a very light structure. Now, you'll also notice, if we look at some of the other things that I've done, that I do add some sheet wood here and there. Where I know there's going to be high stress, I try to put some sheet wood on the mold, on the piece, while it's still on the mold. While it's still on the mold, it's very durable. You can press on it, and you don't have to be particularly concerned about breakage. Once that's been taken off, to add things to it can be a bit tedious because it's fairly fragile now, and things will break if you press on them. So it's better to try to figure out if you want a base plate somewhere or something like that, to do that while it's still on the mold, and then lift that off with the mold. You can also sand the basic shape of the piece while it's still on the mold before you remove it.
Not only has Dennis Norman expanded the horizons of rubber power modeling by his innovation, he's always ready to help others. His unselfish sharing of ideas will certainly contribute to the growth of our hobby. But what about Dennis? Where does he go from here? What's your next goal? Where are you going to go after now you've built 4 engines? Are we going to maybe a B-36 or?
Oh, B-36, yeah. Well, I'll tell you, here's, if you want to know my personal little agenda on rubber-powered multis, I've been sort of working my way through the Second World War and 4 engines. I've done the Lancaster, which I think was the best British heavy subject. I've done a B-17 unsuccessfully. I have done a B-24 that looks promising. Right now I'm going back to the B-17. We just had Memphis Belle out here, the movie, a few months ago, and lots of enthusiasm. I must have seen it 7 or 8 times. Yeah. Movie theaters love me. I come to, when they show airplanes, I'm there with my money. But I'm working on getting to see, can I get a B-17 to fly? When I get that one done, well, I've thought about it. The Privateer has always interested me. That's a variation of the B-24, Navy version. I want to build a B-29. And yes, I'd like to build a B-36 someday and make it rubber-powered. I'm staying with rubber because I feel that it is a discipline of its own. I know that we have electric motors, and gasoline motors, and diesel engines, and things like that. We have that technology to make multi-engine airplanes fly. That's not the challenge. Because if you want a multi-airplane engine to fly, get yourself a gasoline engine, build yourself a radio control model, and fly it. You can do that. The challenge is to take the oldest form of modeling, free flight modeling, rubber-powered modeling, and see how far we can take it. Can we take it to fairly sophisticated ends? Can we have multi-engines that fly and fly well? Yeah, that's a flight. There's no question that airplane is flying.
Dennis Norman, a man who's discovered the challenge and the joy of rubber-powered model airplanes. A man worthy of the title Master Modeler.